Hi, everyone. My name is Tasha Nowla. I'm the Public Programs Manager at New York City Bird Alliance. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight for our first lecture of the season. This is our first installment of our lecture series, which runs from December to March this year. A special thanks to Claude and Lucine Block for their ongoing support for this series. Before we start, a few housekeeping notes. Please note that this lecture is being recorded. You might have noticed that when you signed in, and the recording will be posted later this week on our website for anyone to view. But don't worry, only me and the speakers are on the Zoom, so you won't be in the recording yourselves. Please also know that we have enabled closed captioning for this Zoom, and it will also be available in the recording if you need it. And then finally, please use the Q&A feature on Zoom for any questions so that we don't miss them during the lecture series. At the end of the lecture, I will ask the questions out loud to our speaker, but also feel free to use the Zoom chat function for general comments and share where you guys are coming from tonight. Um, and we'll get started with our program. Before that, I'll give a quick introduction for those who don't know about us at New York City Bird Alliance. We are a conservation nonprofit that protects wild birds and their habitat across New York City, and we do that through science, engagement, and advocacy. So we have a number of science research projects, including bird surveys and monitoring efforts across the city, often using community science volunteers for that work. So if you're ever interested in the spring, you can join us and help us collect data on bird populations and conservation threats. I'll drop a link in the chat where if you ever wanted to know about our conservation, you can take a look at that. But from that data, we use that information to inform our advocacy efforts to protect birds. So whether that's working with officials to get legislation passed, or working with city buildings to make them safer for and reduce bird collisions at specific locations. And for that, we also need volunteers and people involved in our work. So always make sure to check our newsletter for any advocacy efforts that we put out. As most of the times those are urgent needs. And then lastly, you guys are all here for a lecture. So we do a number of programs throughout the year. We have bird outings, classes, workshops, and we attend festivals throughout the years. And during the winter, when things slow down and we want to be inside and cozy, we have our winter lecture series, which we're really excited to kick off tonight with our guest, Ryan Goldberg. So, like I said, this runs from December to March, and we'll be hosting a number of birders, authors, and conservation scientists who discuss the magic of birds and their work as it relates to birding and their passion. And yeah, I'll introduce Ryan and then I'll hand it off to him to get started. But Ryan Goldberg is the author of Bird City Adventures in New York's Urban Wilds, which just came out. So we're very excited to hear more about it and see what's in the book if you haven't already done so yourself. He's also an award-winning journalist who has written for the New York Times, Texas Monthly, Popular Science, among many others. And he lives in Brooklyn, so he's a New Yorker, like myself and many of us too. And he began birding in 2016. So thank you, Ryan, for joining us. We're very excited to have you, and I'll let you take it from here.
Great. Thank you so much, Tasha. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here tonight talking about my book. Um, so Bird City was published last month on November 4th. The publisher is Algonquin, which is an imprint within Little Brown and Hachette. So I thought I would start out by just giving a little bit of an overview of the book. and a little bit of how this came to pass. As you said, I started birding in 2016 in Brooklyn. I grew up in New Jersey, but I've lived in New York for 20 years now. And I've been a reporter for quite a bit longer, since my high school days. I'm working at a paper called the Asbury Park Press in New Jersey. And for the longest time in my journalism career, the things that I wrote about were not in any way related to the environment or ecology. I wrote about vice, I wrote about crime, I wrote about horse racing, a lot of different topics that were sort of investigative in nature. But once I started birdwatching in 2016, that completely began to shift. And for me, it happened rather quickly. I joined the Brooklyn Bird Club. And I started to just become a part of this birding community that was just incredible to me. The people that were within it, the passion and the enthusiasm that people had for watching migration in the city, for protecting the wild spaces of New York. And it was also having never been a birder before, never even really noticed birds until I was in my early 30s at this point, it just completely changed the way that I saw New York, which was a city that I thought I knew well, as a resident, but really felt like I didn't know it at all. And what was so amazing to me was once I started birding, I realized that I didn't need to leave New York to find wildness. And so, what was really fascinating was as I began birding in New York, I began to see it through the lens of a reporter as well. And it was a city that, to me, was really shaped by birds and birders. And especially after the pandemic, it was becoming even more so. And so you had things like Local Law 15, which I'll mention a little bit, talk a little bit about more later, which was a law that mandated bird safe glass on all new constructions in New York, which passed in 2020 and went into effect the following year. You had a program like Project Safelight, New York City Bird Alliance's collisions monitoring program. You had the New York City Plover Project, which started 2021 as well. And there were a lot of great older groups and clubs that were doing conservation work, but then you had new ones that were starting as well. Feminist Bird Club, Black Birders Week, Queer Birders, the McGorlick Bird Club in Brooklyn. And so, what was kind of apparent to me as I set out to start writing this book in 2021 was that there were people who had been on the scene for a long time. And now there were a lot of new people coming on the scene to really together put their stamp on the ecology of the city, and in all five boroughs. And so, Bird City, the book, as I set out my reporting in 2022, I set out to write about this throughout the city and not, one particular borough. The cover of the book is like sort of set in Brooklyn, which is where I live. It's looking sort of into Manhattan, so that maybe attests a little bit to my outer borough perspective. I've never lived in Manhattan in all those 20 years, so. And so some of those people that really started to put their stamp on the ecology of this city, I'll be talking about some of them today. And so there were a few books that really kind of inspired me to, and sort of I almost use as a little bit of a model for the book. One was a book called Season at the Point by Jack Connor, which was all about migration in Cape May in the early 90s and set in one sort of fall season. Another was a great book from the 1970s called The Beautiful Swimmers by William Warner, which was all about the Atlantic blue crab and the Chesapeake Bay watermen whose lives revolve around that crab. And another book that was just an incredible inspiration for me was a book by Scott Weidensaul called Living on the Wing, which was a real epic about migration that came out in the late 90s. And there was something from Weidensaul's preface to that book that really stuck with me. In it, he said that he traveled virtually the length of the hemisphere to write that book, to report the book, logging nearly 70,000 miles by jet, car, bush planes, sailing ketch, tundra buggy, dugout canoe, horseback, and on foot, yet traveling fewer miles than a single small sandpiper would in its short lifetime, propelled only by muscle and the instinct to migrate. But when I read that, I asked myself, what if I didn't have to travel 70,000 miles? Um, New York City has seen 430 species of birds on record, and it could be more. That's just what eBird has. And that is about a third of all the species that have ever been seen in the United States, including Alaska and Hawaii. And by some estimates, 250 or more of those species are regular migrants to New York. So the world is urbanizing. 70% of the world's population is expected to be living in cities by 2050. And so birds have no choice but to pass through urban habitats. And one reason I wanted to write this book is because I feel like what happens here in New York matters. It matters for the birds. It matters for the people who are watching the birds, and maybe some who aren't even watching and don't realize that we kind of have this interrelated kind of connection, and that what's good for birds is good for people. And that also, of course, other cities look to New York City. And so, but most of all, as a New Yorker for now 20 years, some of my favorite writing has always been about New York and this great city. One of my favorites is Joe Mitchell's Up in the Old Hotel. Mitchell was a writer for the New Yorker in the 40s and 50s. And in his writing, there was always a lot of interesting, eccentric, and colorful characters. And so tonight, I want to talk about four of those characters because they very much make up the frame and the structure of the book. And the book is structured by season, and it begins in winter and ends in fall. And so I wanted to look at four people who kind of play a role in each season of the book. Because to me, this bird city we live in is much more interesting and more colorful and a lot safer for birds as a result of their work. So here is Peter Dorish. Peter is a sort of legendary Brooklyn birder. If I had I would say maybe my greatest motivation for writing this book was to write about Peter. On the left is an article I wrote for the Village Voice in 2017 about Peter. The headline kind of sums up his role, the Birdman of Prospect Park. Peter has worked for the Prospect Park Alliance on the natural resources crew, maintaining the habitat and restoring the habitat in the park for coming on 25 years now. And the subheadline in this article is really great as well. It says, "For Brooklyn birders, there is no higher authority than Peter Dorish." That kind of speaks to two things, I think. One is that Peter also writes a blog about Brooklyn bird sightings. And Peter's also religious, and he's a Catholic. Who one of the first times I met him, he pulled a bottle of holy water in a plastic bottle out of the trunk of his car that he had gotten at the age of 18 when he went to go see Pope John Paul at Shea Stadium. So Peter is very much a higher authority for Brooklyn birders. And I met Peter in 2016, the week I started birding. And so a little bit about Peter, which is so interesting to me. Really, for him, a bird changed his life. Peter grew up in Brooklyn. He's only lived in two different places his entire life. He grew up near the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and Peter's father died when he was 13. The following year, when he was 14, a scarlet tanager appeared in the backyard of his house. And so Peter grew up like in the shadow of the Brooklyn Queens Expressway, the BQE. And this was not something that he really would have anticipated. He kind of knew Blue Jays and Cardinals that his mother would show him like through the windows of their living room. But when this scarlet tanager appeared in his backyard, he was just it was a transformational experience for him, and that was his spark bird. He raced off to the library to find out what that bird was and where it came from, and at that point his family got him a pair of binoculars. Peter joined the Brooklyn Bird Club in 1978, a few years later, and he was welcomed by older birders, and since then he has done the same for many others like me. Peter has been the president of the Brooklyn Bird Club. He currently plans the trips for the club. He was the editor of the newsletter. He was probably the secretary and the accountant or the treasurer at some point for the club. So Peter's life really revolves around birding and revolves around birds. The first time I met him was on a walk he led at Greenwood Cemetery in on Mother's Day in 2016. And it was a day that, for me, hooked me, and my sort of journey began then. We saw 20 warbler species that day, most of them in one red oak tree that Peter pointed out to us. And I'll never forget that he also talked about the things that the birds needed. He talked about the trees that they depended on. He talked about oak trees being the most important native tree that migrating songbirds look for and feed on, the caterpillars that come off the tree. And so at that point, I sort of thought to myself, like, I'm just learning the birds. I should know the trees too. Um, and at the time, Peter said that warblers make you do really crazy things. He had an acronym for it. It was OCWA, which is the banding code for the orange crown warbler. But for Peter, it means obsessive compulsive warbler addiction. Um, and so it was at that point that I really started asking myself, what is the city I live in, and how do I interact with it? For Peter, it was like, it was the oak trees, it was bird migration, it was family, it was going to church on Sundays, and most of all, it was the Brooklyn Bird Club, the trips he planned and the trips he led for the club. For me, my experience in New York up until that point had been very different. It was like going out, it was seeing friends, it was not in any way connected to the natural world. And I felt like seasons would pass for me without me even realizing it. And I also realized and learned from Peter a really important question, I think, which was, how do we choose to spend our lives? For Peter, his life is very much about service, both to the Brooklyn Bird Club and to birds. And so here's a photo from Breezy Point. For a number of years, I've joined Peter for the winter waterfowl count that the State Ornithological Association puts on. And it's the opening scene of the book as well. And Breezy Point is a place that Peter loves. Peter is deaf, and so he's not able to identify birds based on sound. He's trained his eyes and his life to have like be able to pick up the finest movements. And Breezy Point is a place that Peter loves because it's an incredibly quiet and tranquil place, and he wears a hearing aid in one ear. So to be able to step out and away from the cacophony of New York is a real salve for him, I believe. And this was. Yeah, every year we go out for the waterfowl count. Sometimes it has gotten me into some tricky spots. This is one of the great illustrations that was done in the book by Amy Lusty, a wonderful artist and naturalist. And you could see the sort of bird in the center there is a king eider. The very first waterfowl count I did with Peter in 2018, we found a male king eider, and it was the first time he had seen that duck on the waterfowl count after something like 30 years. And he told me, sort of shouted for me to follow that bird, which I did. And for anyone who knows Breezy Point, the tip has this long rock jetty, which is very slick in the wintertime. And I decided to follow that bird all the way onto the rocks where I could get a better view, and then crashed out, sprained my wrist, drew blood, tried to protect my scope so it wouldn't get cracked. And after all that, thinking, we've been counting ducks all day. Can we just leave now? Peter said, do you want to still keep going? And so I learned that Peter's dedication to science, as well as the accuracy of a count. So here's Peter in his office, which is Lookout Hill in Prospect Park. That is the Butterfly Meadow on the right, which is a place that he and several volunteer crews that he manages maintain. It's about 3 acres and requires a ton of work to remove invasives and keep planting native stuff that the birds love. Peter worked, he's been a birder for 50 years. He's celebrating his 50th year now. But before he worked at the Prospect Park Alliance in 2000, before he started working there in 2001, he had worked at a bank, sort of a bank job for 16 years. And he jokingly said that he went from an office of 5 feet to an office of 500 acres. He does not include the lake. in that because he can't walk on water is what he says. So what's so interesting, and I'll kind of wrap up with Peter here, is that he thought taking this job he would get to do more birding probably, but he doesn't. He is kind of working to restore and maintain Lookout Hill. It's a steep, um, there's steep slopes. There's a lot of eroded slopes. It's a real rugged area to be working, and I feel like myself as a birder and many in Brooklyn, we get to enjoy the sort of fruits of his hard labor. And so he's coming up on his 25th anniversary for the Prospect Park Alliance. And as a result of that, he's going to get to choose a tree to plant, and it's going to be a white oak. So I thought I would play a short video about Peter because I think it's a nice to hear from him and talk about the work that he does.
I grew up in Buck Park. I started birding when I was about 14. There are many ways people birdwatch because I like to hear many of the factors. I rely more on my vision. My eyes are getting so unfamiliar with small movement that I can detect it so quickly. I just stand there and watch the bird as it moves, so I follow it, stay on it. My name is Peter Shai. I work with the Natural Resources Crew across the Park Alliance. Park Park is one of the best birding areas in the Northeast. Migratory birds see this mass of green and they need protective cover, food, water, which helps them continue their journeys. Because I'm so connected to birds, I figured let me give back to nature and build habitats. Proctor Park has the only freshwater lake and largest rock falls in Brooklyn.
Okay. Sorry for that quite abrupt thing, but the video goes on. Um, so why is Peter's restoration work in Prospect Park and on Lookout Hill so important? This kind of gives you a good shot of that. That's Greenwood Cemetery on the left and Prospect Park on the right. You can see the lake, as Peter mentioned, the only freshwater lake in Brooklyn. And that little neighborhood south of the park with you can see some more green on it is Ditmas Park and Prospect Park South. So um, a great sea of concrete. And this is what songbirds that migrate across New York City see in the spring and fall. And this is what they see at daybreak. Most birds, as probably people tuning in know, migrate nocturnally. And so at daybreak, they're looking for a place to land. And they follow leading lines like rivers, like the terminal moraine, which is the kind of glacial ridge that cuts through Brooklyn and into Queens and Staten Island in the other direction. And so um, this is really the only places that birds have to drop in safely. And so this is kind of what birds on the left here saw 400 years ago. This is a sort of potentially what Henry Hudson saw in 1609 coming up the river that would bear his name. This is from Eric Sanderson's Mannahatta. And on the right is what it looks like now. And so this is what birds are seeing as they're migrating. They're looking for a place to land, and as probably everyone here realizes, there are many hazards that they face. The biggest danger of all, of course, is glass. Some of the slides and videos coming up may be a little shocking and sad. They're going to show birds that have collided with glass, so I thought I would just give a warning of that. This is a American woodcock that I found in March of 2023 on Pine Street in Lower Manhattan. This is really in the first months that I started reporting the book. And for those who don't know, birds don't see glass as a solid surface. They see a reflection of sky and trees. They do not see something that they're about to fly into. And so this was one bird I had found, and it was actually one of the first I'd ever found in New York, incredibly. But according to New York City Bird Alliance, almost 250,000 birds die in fatal collisions with glass each year. And the reason that New York City Bird Alliance knows this is because of programs like Project Safelight, which is a collisions monitoring program that began in 1997. I write a lot about it in the book, from the origins to the volunteers who are working in that program today and getting up in the dark to go inspect buildings around the city. And I wanted to write about Project Safelight through the eyes of one of its volunteers. Um, the one that very graciously and kindly allowed me to escort her around finding dead and injured birds is Melissa Breyer in this photo. And the reason I sort of chose Melissa is because, well, for one, she is monitoring some of the deadliest buildings in the city, which is at the World Trade Center. And I had been, even before I started writing the book, I'd been on Twitter and kind of following this really important subject. And I could see that Melissa was cataloging and documenting the perils of the built environment for birds. And so these are just some screenshots from, I think it was 2022 actually, in just a few weeks in September of that year. And what Melissa was seeing and encountering. She even told a kind of incredible story about one day at the World Trade Center going around and picking up birds, and somebody came up to her and said, "Are you the dead bird lady from Twitter?" And she felt in that moment that that was her, how she would be remembered. Melissa joined Project Safelight in 2020 when there were about 30 volunteers. Her sort of catalyst for that was she saw a photo on Twitter herself of the Circa building, which is a 11-story glass apartment building on the north side of Central Park. And she saw a photo of 26 dead birds outside that building. And this was in the first few months of the pandemic. And at that moment, she thought to herself, how senseless is this? We're already surrounded by so much death. Can't we prevent this? Why do we need to be adding more to it? And in 2020, then she volunteered. The program was on hiatus because of the pandemic, and it picked up again in the fall. In 2021, Melissa was moved to the World Trade Center site, her current route, and 2 weeks into the season, on September 14th, 2021, she went out that morning after a storm, had clearly grounded birds that were flying beneath the sort of low cloud ceiling, and the downtown lights had lured them into these canyons of glass that Lower Manhattan has. And so this is a video that Melissa took from that morning. And so there's no audio here, but Melissa found 229 dead birds that morning. 29 were still alive, and she was able to get them to some Catherine Quayle from the Wild Bird Fund, brought them back to the Wild Bird Fund on the Upper West Side. When she got home that day, she laid them all out. At the time, she didn't even know how many she had in her backpack. So as you can see here, this was obviously big news. It was international news, and there was worldwide outrage about it. And um, in the aftermath of that, New York City passed a lights out law for city-owned buildings and city lease buildings. I know that there's still a lot of advocacy work trying to extend that to all buildings in New York City. But what's so interesting is when I interviewed Melissa and got to know her better, I wondered like what this effort was doing to her and how painful it was to be able to get up and do this every morning, almost half the year in the spring and fall. And one thing that she told me really stuck with me, which is that for her, the data point for Project Safelight and for D-Bird is these birds' obituary. And to her, having that record tells her that these birds did not die in vain. And hard as it is to go around picking up birds off the sidewalks of New York, that type of record keeping can be used for change. And so these are just a few of the success stories from that. On the left was an article in the New York Times about the Circa building, which New York City Bird Alliance and architects from FX Collaborative worked with that building, the co-op board, to have the glass retrofitted. The photo on the right is of a park down at the World Trade Center called Liberty Park, which Melissa found a number of birds that had collided with just this very small glass railing. And the Port Authority decided to retrofit it very quickly. There are other success stories like this. The Brookfield Ferry Terminal is another one. The Brookfield Winter Garden Atrium. And so when Melissa started Project Safe Flight, there were 30 volunteers. Now I believe there are about 200 volunteers. And so one thing she said to me that really stuck with me was that a little bit of pain for her went a long way. And so that was sort of spring migration. The third section of the book is about the summertime. And obviously, people probably know that there aren't that many large breeding territories, breeding grounds in New York. Birds pass on through New York, but they don't stick around through the summer. There are obviously some exceptions. Some of those are depicted here. There's the Rockaways with the piping plovers. The middle sort of illustration there is of a grasshopper sparrow at Fresh Kills in Staten Island. On the right is a gray egret at the Bronx River, and a bird that may be nesting in one of the harbor islands in New York City. And of course, there's Jamaica Bay. So Jamaica Bay is an estuary. It's a place where salt and fresh water mix. It's a really rich ecosystem and probably the most important habitat in all of New York City. Over 300 species, over 330 species of birds have been seen at the Jamaica Bay Wildlife Refuge, and over 100 species of fish. There's whales, there's dolphins, there's seals. You can see many of the marsh islands inside the bay there. You know, the islands have seen better days, but there are a number of people and groups that are working to restore those islands. In the book, I devote a whole chapter to one of those people. Here he is. This is Don Reapy. Don, I could probably write a whole book about Don. I had to settle for one chapter. So I'll just kind of go through a little bit. Here is Don's house. He lives in Broad Channel, which is the only inhabited island in Jamaica Bay. He grew up in Ozone Park with his exploring the wilds of around Jamaica Bay with his buddies. He went to St. John's. He was a high school teacher. Don was a park ranger in 1974, which was the first season for Gateway National Recreation Area when the federal government took over the refuge from the city. And in 2003, he became the Guardian of the Bay, a title that was given to him by the state. And he became the executive director of the Littoral Society chapter in Jamaica Bay. I made several trips to visit Don. He is an incredibly colorful character. This is just a shot of his desk. There are always people coming and going. The previous photo showed the door open. Every time I went to visit Don, the door was open or unlocked. People come and go. It's a wonderful place, and his house is really like a, a maritime museum. It's really a testament and a museum to Jamaica Bay. And there's always interesting things happening at his house. This is a photo on the left of Don as a flamenco dancer, probably in the 1980s. And the photo on the right is from just this past weekend at the Littoral Society's holiday party in the Rockaways. Don's 86 now, and he's still dancing flamenco, and he put on quite the show that night. He also always has visitors to his house. His house is right on the bay, so some of the visitors are feathered, some are human. This is his most famous visitor. This is Edgar, that Don has named the Great Egret. And Edgar has been visiting Don for well over 10 years now. There's Don slicing some salmon for Edgar, who's developed somewhat of an expensive taste. And then here's Edgar kind of just waiting on Don's back deck, looking for a little bit of a snack. And so just back to Don's desk really quickly, there's something that stands out here, which is this barn owl. The barn owl is Don's favorite bird. When push comes to shove, that's the one that he says. And so, of the many trips that I took to visit Don for this book, my favorite was when we went on his boat to go look for barn owl chicks on a number of islands that he has placed boxes over the years. And so, between for the last 30 years or so, Don has helped to ban almost 400 barn owlets. He does this with New York City DEP's Chris Nadareski, who bans the birds. And we went to a place called Subway Island, which is has a pretty remarkable history. This is was made by to allow the A train to cross to the Rockaways in the 1950s. Here's Don looking into the barn owl box. I wasn't sure if we were going to see any. Raccoons had actually gone to that island to take that basically raccoons scared off the nesting colony of egrets and other wading birds there. So I wasn't sure we were going to see barn owls, but we did. These are two owlets. The one on the right was kind of doing something called toe dusting, where they kind of go side to side. Probably only stayed there for 2 seconds. Did not want to, unsettle the birds any more than we had to. So, it's interesting. I wanted to maybe read a really quick passage because I always wondered why the barn owl was his favorite bird. And at the end of this trip, it was obvious to me why it was. I mean, seeing these owlets was really incredible. And he told me why it was his favorite bird. And I'll just read a really quick passage from the book about this. In the late 1940s, he had a little gang of his buddies. They called themselves the Rawhides. And they were biking one day by an old incinerator by Idlewild Airport, which was the first name of JFK. And Don saw a white bird fly out of this incinerator, and he called it an owl. Nobody believed him in his little group, and so they went back the next day on a little expedition. He doesn't know how they found it, but they went back with a grappling hook, a net, and a broom. And so this is just, in Don's words, what happened next. He says, somehow we were able to get up to the first story of the incinerator, and then we threw the grappling hook over the top until it held. We climbed inside to reach the incinerator. There were 2 owls in there. One flew out a window, but we threw a net over the other one. Since we were all afraid of this thing, we drew straws to see who was going to go down to get it. I think it was Tommy Shepard, since he was the leader. He went down and pulled it out of the net and put it in the burlap sack. We carried it back to my friend's house and put chicken wire over half the garage. What an expedition, we thought. We brought this thing back alive. But then we had to feed it. We didn't know what it ate. We found a pigeon, a small pigeon, and put that in. The pigeon walked over to the owl, and kids are bloodthirsty, you know. We were cheering, but nothing happened. The next day, we found a small cat, larger than a kitten, but not full grown. We put it in there and figured this was going to be a fight to the death. But the cat stayed at one end and the owl at the other, and they didn't bother with each other, so we let the owl go. And so I asked Don, who was a product of 18 years of Catholic schooling in Queens, if this was him doing penance. His restoration of the barn owl in Jamaica Bay was penance. He said he was not a religious man, but he kind of laughed at that. I do think that he has been making up to that first barn owl for the last 30 plus years of his life. And so I did a lot in Jamaica Bay, and I'll just kind of go sort of quickly through the rest of this. But I did a lot in Jamaica Bay. And besides that, one of the most eye-opening experiences was joining the Harbor Heron Survey that New York City Bird Alliance has been organizing since the late 1970s. And here's a photo with Shannon Curley, Dr. Shannon Curley, who led the survey that I did in 2023. I went with Shannon to Little Egg Marsh, which is an island in Jamaica Bay. Shannon, for those who don't know her, she grew up in Long Island. She got her PhD and taught at CUNY Staten Island with Dick Veet. Then she worked at Cornell at the Lab of Ornithology, doing her postdoc studying offshore migration, and now she teaches at Stony Brook. There's a whole chapter about fresh kills, which is obviously the landfill in Staten Island. that was capped and is now an incredible grassland habitat. Shannon has been studying the grassland birds at Fresh Kills as well for the last 10 years. Um, Fresh Kills is these right two photos. It's a tall grass prairie. You would never think you're in New York City. But with Shannon, and especially for the last section of the book about fall, I wanted to talk briefly about artificial light, which is that another sort of hazard and peril of the built environment here. Um, on 2000, on September 11th, 2023, I joined New York City Bird Alliance's Tribute in Light monitoring, and Shannon was there that night as well. And so birds migrate at night using a real suite of celestial cues, and light confuses them. It scrambles those cues. It sort of strips away their compass. And now this is what birds would normally see of Manhattan at night. And light is obviously a global problem. You can see this map here. Obviously, the sort of highlighted green areas are where light pollution is the greatest. And it's obviously more pronounced in the northern hemisphere. But this is where birds are migrating to. And so this map here shows the migration passages of birds, and you can see how neatly they overlap the areas of the greatest light pollution. And tribute in light is like that light pollution on steroids. Um, Birds are drawn in from miles away. And in one 6-year period, scientists found that over 1 million birds had their flight paths altered because of tribute in light. Um, this is the roof of the parking garage where Tribute Light is set up. There's 88 light bulb xenon, 7,000 watt xenon light bulbs, and it has been going on since March of 2002. At the time, it was the strongest shafts of light ever projected into the night sky. And so in 2007, New York City Bird Alliance won a huge victory, which was that whenever there were 1,000 birds trapped in the beams, they would be able to get a 20-minute shutoff. And I volunteered in 2023 to be one of the people counting the birds in the beams. And as I walked up that night, this is what I saw. And at first, I thought that what was in the beams were insects because they were flying erratically like insects. But in fact, as I got up to the roof that night and sort of saw the tenseness and the concern on people's faces, I realized that those weren't insects, those were birds. And now Shannon had actually set up a thermal camera on the roof that night to actually try to study what the birds were doing when the lights were on and then what they were doing when they were off. And so this I found so illuminating and wrote about it in the book. Here's the video that Shannon took of the birds inside the beams as they're on, and you can see that they're sort of flying at cross purposes, almost like they're flying into some force field. And there's no sound on this video, obviously, but for me that night, these birds were calling, and these flight calls kind of rained down, and they got louder and louder as more birds piled up into the beams. And it was sort of like birds were trying to find a path through the traffic, and their calls are sort of like honking at a driver encroaching on your lane. But once the beams went off, they scattered, they went away, which showed to Shannon how important it was to have that shut off. And now here's a sort of video that Shannon shot as well that same week in Jamaica Bay. This is a little slow to develop, but I wanted to include this because this is what birds should look like when they're migrating. And so you can kind of see these little faint things. Some will be a little more clear, but it sort of looks like, well, one, it's much slower. And two, these migrations are unidirectional. These birds are almost like snowflakes drifting in the wind. And so this is the last slide. This is the illustration by Amy Lusty of Tribute in Light. And that night on the roof, I sort of asked myself a question, which was, why do we honor the dead by harming other living things? I had followed these birds across the city for several years and more, and I was angry. I was upset. It felt to me at that time, that night, like it was a really cruel thing to do. What I will say is that Shannon's take was more complex than mine. She was wearing an FDNY sweatshirt that night that had been her father's, Michael Curley, who was a Brooklyn firefighter for 25 years. And she said that night to me that I understand the value of Tribute in Light, because it makes me feel emotionally connected to my father. But then she also feels this visceral reaction of seeing the impact on the birds. Um, but one thing she said was certain was that she was very happy that the scientists from New York City Bird Alliance and other volunteers were on hand to monitor it and advocate for the birds. So thank you for that. This is just the book cover again. And if you would like to learn more about the book itself, about me, and anything else you can see there, I have my personal website. So thank you so much for listening to that.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. I remember when we first started talking about this lecture series, I have the book and I had just started at New York City Bird Alliance for less than a year, and so I loved reading your book because I got to learn more about the people that I have just met or I have just known by email, and also the places. You cover a lot of, I know you talked a lot about people, but you talk a lot about the parks and the places that you got to visit, and it helped me really visualize this birding landscape that I was new to, and was also learning. So I really enjoyed your book, and it really has helped me as I've settled into my role. This presentation is being recorded. If anyone has any questions, you can put them in the chat or the Q&A feature. Um, and but I do have a question of my own because I read the book and there's a lot of moments that you share meeting birders and scientists. And I guess my question is like, how did you choose what moments belonged in the book? And if there's any uh, moments that nearly made it that you can share with us now. Hmm.
Yeah, I think the structure of the book, of writing it by season kind of allowed me to sort of have a sense as I laid out my reporting plan to know like things that um, would certainly be in there, like, a great day of spring migration in May. I knew that that would happen, and if I would be available, I could experience it and write about it. I knew, for instance, about tribute and light, so I knew that that would be something I wanted to experience and write about. Similarly, the harbor herons. So there were a lot of events and that I already knew would be part of the book, and that went into my proposal for the book. And then things that I felt like I had to, maybe I would just be open to things that transpired. One of those was Flacco, and so there's a whole chapter in the book about owl ethics. And it just so happened during my research for the book that Flacco flew out of the Central Park Zoo after his cage was vandalized, and that became obviously a really interesting and kind of compelling story. One thing that I had hoped to get in the book, and I just sort of ran out of time a bit, was I'm very interested in like habitats in New York that are ephemeral, that are sort of temporary, and places like that that are maybe intentionally so, like the East Pond of Jamaica Bay, where the water level is drawn down in the summer to provide mudflats for migrating shorebirds, and places like a salt marsh, like Plum Beach in Brooklyn, where tidal flats form twice a day at low tide. But then other habitats that are sort of a reflection of the built environment, sort of buckling or crumbling and allowing room for birds. So, one story I had hoped to really get in the book was about a place in the Bronx called Orchard Beach. There's a huge parking lot there, and in 2017 or 18, that parking lot began to crack and potholes formed. And those potholes, when they filled with water, became a real haven for shorebirds that season. And it was like for about 3 months. And the Bronx birder who found that, Jack Rothman, was like leading puddle bird walks that year. And it was just to me, a sort of emblematic story of, if we give habitat to birds, even habitat that may not even seem that important, they're going to use it and they need more of it.
Mm. Yeah. Um, this awesome. And yeah, I guess you've been a journalist your entire uh previous to this, and this is the first time you're writing about environment, nature, birding landscape, something you're very passionate about. I wanted to know, how did this writing feel compared to your other work? And was it more challenging, easier? Um, Anything about the writing process itself?
Yeah, it was one part that was challenging was writing about people that I had known for a while. I mentioned a few of those, like Peter Dorish and Don Reapy. Um, they were friends of mine before I started writing the book. And so that was a slight challenge, like writing about people you know well. By one token, you know so much about them that you can paint a full portrait, and the other, you need to write about them accurately and completely write about them with both their many positives as well as their quirks as well. So that was a challenge. I hadn't really experienced that in my journalism career. Another thing was, I think, writing about myself a little bit. A lot of the investigative journalism I've done in my career, there's not really been a place for personal observations. And that was something that came into the book, especially as I was out in the field, just kind of observing nature, observing the city, and thinking about what I thought about certain things that I was seeing. And so that's a challenge. It's something that my editor certainly pushed me to do on the rewrites for the book, and to just have a little bit more of maybe my own birding journey in here, but a little bit more about what I thought about just these really interesting and dynamic things that go on in New York City's bird life.
Yeah, yeah, it's always nice to, I feel like a lot of the sentiment you had in the book, I felt as I was learning about it too. So it's nice to feel connected in that way, and also connect to the people as well. We have some questions from our audience that I'll start to ask, right? But aside from New York City, has there been any other place that you visited that has had special birding related stories?
Well, Cape May, which I sort of mentioned at the top briefly, is certainly one. This book, Season at the Point about Cape May, is a wonderful book about that magnificent place, which is one of the most spectacular migratory sort of bottlenecks in the country. So I would say Cape May is, an amazing place with an amazing history. Um, Certainly, like I've been to birding in Southeast Arizona, which is kind of famous for the variety of habitats there, from saguaro desert to sort of Sky Island mountain peaks covered in snow. And a book that kind of comes to mind is kind of talking about that area really nicely was Ken Kaufman's book, Kingbird Highway. And so just that was kind of the first time I kind of learned about that area of the country and just how diverse and wonderful the bird life is.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think your book focuses on New York City and how birding can really happen everywhere. And one thing that we say a lot at New York City Bird Alliance is that birds are the most accessible wildlife we have in urban landscapes. But it's also nice to remember that these birds are migrating through and that we're all connected, and that birding can happen anywhere, anytime. And so, um, yeah. And then another question we had here, I'm not sure if you can answer, but I can also help. During your time researching the book, are there any precedent for large buildings and institutions that have solved their bird glass strike problems or well addressed them well? Do you have any examples?
Sure. The biggest one is by far, I think, the Javits Center, the convention center on the west side of Manhattan. And I write about this in a chapter called Safe Flight in the book. And the Javits Center is a great success story because it went from being the most deadly building for birds in kind of the 2000s, to once it retrofitted its glass kind of as part of a big renovation. I think it was 2013 is maybe when it was completed. It was about a 4 or 5 year retrofit. They replaced all the glass, either got rid of some glass completely because the Javits Center was like a monument to glass. Even the utility closets had glass around them.
Yeah.
Um, they replaced about a quarter of the glass completely, and then 3/4 of the glass they applied these kind of dot pattern called frit to make it bird safe. And I think that first year after it was completed, volunteers found maybe two dead birds. And so the
Mhm.
Javits Center is by far the finest example of what's possible. Certainly outside of New York City, and I mention it briefly in the book, is the McCormick Center in Chicago, which was kind of an infamous building for bird collisions for 40 plus years. And just recently, after a really tragic day where over 1,000 birds were killed just at the McCormick Center, the owners of that building decided to retrofit the glass as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and the Javits Center is one of the locations that New York City Bird Alliance scientists do research and monitor. But yeah, I think it was like 90% within the first year of it being renovated that it completely declined. And it's been a good example for other buildings and other places too. So we have 5 minutes left, so I'm gonna try to um, we might have time for one more question, and are you optimistic about the future of our birds, especially with the pronounced decline of the bird population?
Gosh, that's a hard question.
I know, yeah.
Um, I think I'm generally an optimistic person, so I guess I feel like I'm optimistic in that there are more birders than ever before, um, and that I've seen certainly in New York a huge surge in birders and people interested in birds since the pandemic started. And I think I'm optimistic that that will channel into conservation and working to protect birds through these important spaces. I mean, it needs so much. I mean, migratory birds, especially long distance migrants, are traveling they're forced to kind of cover so much ground and pass through so many perilous situations, and they need protected spaces. So, the two most important things are really improving the habitat that we already have, and then also potentially even expanding and giving birds and certainly other wildlife, even plants, like a way to move north because of climate change. And so it's going to be a lot of work. I think at times I'm optimistic, other times I'm less so, but certainly I feel like we have no choice but to try to do it, and it's really up to us. I mean, really, what happens is completely up to humans at this point, and whether or not these birds are going to have a better future.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, and I think one thing you mentioned early on is like the surge of birding and how that's grown, especially after COVID and a lot of the birding landscape changing. And you highlighted a lot of people that do have been, longtime birders, but there's this new wave of birders also coming in that are can learn from others and be part of these like New York City Bird Alliance or other like Feminist Bird Club and all these other groups that are advocating for birds in New York City. Um, and I'm sure there's plenty in other cities as well. So I did want to end. I w- I see a few questions ha- about if this is going to be recorded. This is going to be recorded. It's going to be posted on our website. So if there's any information that Ryan shared tonight, you can go back and listen in and get that. So definitely stay tuned for an email from us. And the last question I will ask is where can we find your book if anyone is interested?
Yeah, so you can find it everywhere, really, especially you can find it on Amazon. You can find it on bookshop.org. I definitely try to recommend people buy through independent bookstores, so bookshop.org. I've seen it all around New York in all the bookstores I've popped into. So if you have a favorite one in your neighborhood, just go in and see if they have it. If not, they'll order it for you. So yeah, and if you read the book and you enjoy it, I certainly would appreciate a review on Goodreads or on Amazon. I know that helps a lot, and sharing it with your friends as well.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I have the book, definitely highly recommend. Thank you for featuring New York City Bird Alliance in your book. We really appreciate your support. And then for those joining us tonight, thank you so much for joining. We do have another lecture next month with BirdNote. So definitely check out our calendar page if you're interested in joining that one. But hope to see you at an event soon. And thank you, Ryan. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Tasha. Thank you all for
Thank
coming.